The Gauteng provincial government is now conducting a forensic investigation into slain whistleblower Babita Deokaran's allegations regarding questionable payments from the Tembisa Hospital a year after she initially brought up the matter. Professor Prof Van Der Heever from the Wits School of Governance says that the way South Africa's health sector is governed often leaves hospitals exposed to corruption. Well, he joins us now to discuss this further. Professor, always a pleasure to have you on the program.
Good morning.
The issue of corruption in the public sector, I think by now, has been extensively ventilated because of, things like the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, combing through all the different sort of public state of organs and how they could have possibly been captured. But the issue of corruption in our hospitals, in our health sector, just how wide-reaching is that problem right now?
Well, it looks pretty dire in about 8 provinces out of 9. The levels of irregular expenditure are extraordinary. And when you see irregular expenditure, it means that the provincial sort of procurement processes have deviated from the required procurement processes. So this, in many cases, is around about 3.5% of the overall budget spend. And all of that is an indication of potential corruption. And when you see this kind of incident that we've seen at Tembisa, you see how explicit it is, rather than at a high level. And this is the problem, is that when you've got provinces which effectively have become part of the political patronage process, the process by which, in the current situation, the governing party essentially raises funds or organizes corruption for people that are tied to it, it becomes a severe problem. These appointments into the state and all parts of the state allow for the capture and the rigging of the tender processes. And so at that point, nothing is safe, and the people in leadership positions are not proper leaders. They're there to essentially be part of this patronage struggle.
When it comes to Gauteng's public health sector, you note in your article that in the 2020-2021 financial year, irregular expenditure in the province's health department reached a staggering 3.8 billion rand. I mean, that is an astounding figure for irregular expenditure. And of course, it doesn't necessarily get any better as the years go on. Now, you point our attention to the issue of governance, how these particular chief executives of these hospitals are actually appointed. Talk to us about that process. What is the problem with the current process as it stands?
Yeah, so I sort of break it down into sort of 2 elements. The one is how the person is appointed, and the second is how they're held to account. The appointment process itself has become politicized. In other words, it's very easy because pretty much everybody that's appointed into a provincial health department is it's relatively easy for that to become a political appointment. Doesn't mean it is in every instance, because sometimes you actually need somebody who can do the job. But in many cases, the linkage between the political party and the appointment of officials into government structures is one where essentially the process of political appointment is relatively easy to organize. In other words, it's done behind the scenes. That's the first issue. The second issue is how somebody is then held to account. So what you want is for somebody to be held to account for performance, etc. And the governance structure that has appointed that person doesn't have the normal interest that you would have in making sure that somebody does their job properly. So the wrong person has been appointed, and the way they're held to account is severely deficient. And when you add to that the fact that delegations for procurement have been allocated to the chief executives, and you'll see it in the Deokaran case, the 500,000 rand limit they can procure at the hospital level. Now, you don't do that in a system unless you've localized your accountability structure and severed it from potential conflicts of interest. Because what's going to happen is you'll have created a leaky sieve. That's going to become you're going to have money being spent inappropriately at the level of the hospital. And what was done was all these contracts were structured They broke them down so that they would all fall below 500,000. Now that is the problem. When that discretion fell into the hands of a political appointee, you're in a position to essentially structure your procurement process such that you're effectively transferring funds out of the state. So this is the problem, is that you want to have that chief executive held to account much more locally for their procurement process as well as for their general performance. And corruption is just one of the outcomes, just one of the ways in which a failure of performance occurs. It's not the only one. The other is you just don't do your job properly.
Well, if we're talking about localizing accountability, a lot of these public health facilities do have a board of directors that have been appointed to fulfill some sort of an oversight role when it comes to the running of the facility itself. So some may pose the question, where are the boards in this instance? And shouldn't we also be asking questions around how these boards are appointed and whether or not they're actually doing their job?
Well, these boards, their current statutory framework, to be perfectly blunt, is utterly useless. These are advisory boards. They have no intrusive powers to actually investigate what's going on within a particular facility. They have no power to hire and fire the chief executive officer. So essentially, they just catch flies. They have no power to do anything else anyway. So these boards are of no use whatsoever. When you do create a localized accountability structure, you have to create a very specific accountability framework that allocates powers to that board to do things in relation to that hospital. And part of doing that is ensuring that those boards are independent, which means you have to look at how are the members nominated, appointed, and who removes them. And if you, through the way in which you establish the appointment process for board members, create a conflict of interest with the political structures of government, then you've got a problem. That boards must be independent of the MEC. They must be independent of any political party. And in that way, when they are then delegated the powers or given the powers to appoint and remove a chief executive officer, they're doing so because of their fiduciary responsibility to that hospital. And this is the problem that we have to solve. We have to design and implement that kind of framework. Otherwise, we leave hospitals exposed to what we're seeing. Well,
we have our three spheres of government, and currently we're focusing on that provincial sphere. Who would these independent boards be answering to exactly if we were to, in fact, overhaul the current governance structure as it stands and completely redesign it to introduce this element of an independent board?
Yeah, so you would still be answerable within the provincial government structure. It doesn't mean that you don't have other kinds of regulatory oversight over what boards do and what the hospitals do, which themselves must be independent. But at the provincial level, at a strategic level, the boards should be answerable to the provinces. And the question is that the way in which that answerability is structured must not allow for the improper exercise of power to target a board that is now doing its job properly. So it will be important to make sure that the intervention from the province occurs only when on issues that it is appropriate for the province to intervene on, and for other parties potentially. But you've got to keep that independence of that board, but they will still be answerable. And they should be answerable at a localized level, in other words, at a regional level to a province, because that's where the service is being provided.
Well, I mean, Prof, where do we begin with, trying to address this problem of sort of endemic corruption that we're seeing in the public sector? Is it a simple case of simply drawing on a lot of the existing policies and frameworks that are there and sort of just redesigning those, or is it a far more long, drawn-out process?
Well, I think that there are things you can do in the interim and things that you can do over the medium term. In the interim, you can actually establish even with the current sort of conflicts, you can establish if a province truly wants to solve this problem, it can very easily. by immediately localizing a lot of the accountability using sort of indirect means. I'm not going into that in detail, but to say where large parts of the problem exist is that the provincial ordinances, the provincial legislatures, are what should be creating institutional environments along the lines that I've just indicated. What's very interesting to note is that most of the provinces, the provincial governments outside of the Western Cape, and I want to distinguish, the Western Cape has got proper legislation. The other provinces have failed to actually alter their legislation significantly from the pre-94 frameworks. And in some cases, they're just operating in a legislative vacuum. What you should have is proper hospital acts at the provincial level. So the legislative process is one level which establishes the framework, the actual institutional framework. The second problem that exists is that a lot of the people that are currently employed within the provincial departments at these leadership levels shouldn't be there. And this is a process in which, first of all, people have to be brought into a different accountability framework, even if it is an interim one. And the second is we need to be installing good leadership into those and removing the people who can't do their job. And I'm afraid many just can't do their job. They shouldn't be hospital CEOs. They're just not the right people.
Well, Professor, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on this morning's program. That's Professor Alex Van Der Heever from the Wits School of Governance.